"Pick anything you want," Elias Whitmore said, kneeling in the middle of Mercer's general store, unaware that his daughters were about to choose the one thing the whole town would never forgive him for. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty front windows, catching in the flour sacks and glass jars of penny candy, turning the air gold and thick as honey. Elias rested one hand on Clara's shoulder and the other on little Molly's back, steady and certain, a man used to making decisions measured in acres and cattle weight, not feelings. He had driven 12 miles from the ranch that morning, wagon wheels rattling over dry ruts, just to see the girls smile. 3 years since their mother passed, and he still counted time by what had been lost instead of what remained. He had promised himself that whatever they pointed at today, a ribbon, a porcelain doll, a bolt of blue fabric, he would buy it without hesitation. He was a man who kept promises. Clara's fingers tightened around his sleeve, but she wasn't looking at the toys stacked near the counter. Molly wasn't staring at the candy jars or the bright tin windmills that spun lazily in the ceiling fan's breeze. Both girls were turned toward the far end of the store, near the shelves of folded cloth and sewing needles, where a woman stood alone with a small bundle of fabric cradled in her arms. Nayeli did not belong to Mercer in the way the other women did. She stood straight, quiet, wearing a simple calico dress she must have sewn herself, dark hair braided down her back, eyes lowered but not in shame, more like patience. A few townsfolk pretended not to notice her, though they had been watching since she stepped inside. The clerk's smile had thinned when she entered. Elias followed his daughter's gaze and felt the subtle shift in the room, the way conversation dimmed without fully stopping. He cleared his throat softly. "Girls," he murmured, thinking they were curious, nothing more. Clara slipped from his hand and walked the 10 feet across the wooden floor, her boots tapping in careful steps. Molly hurried after her, skirts brushing against stacked feed sacks. They stopped in front of Nayeli and stared up at her with open, fearless eyes. Nayeli looked startled, then unsure, as if kindness from strangers was a language she did not trust. Clara reached out and touched the edge of the fabric bundle. "Did you make this?" she asked, voice clear as a church bell. The store grew quieter. Elias rose slowly to his full height, 6'2" in worn leather boots, feeling every set of eyes turned toward him, waiting. He had offered his daughters the world, confident it was something he could afford. He had not expected them to point at a woman the town kept at arm's length. He stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and for the first time that day, he felt unsure of what his own promise might cost him. The store seemed to hold its breath as Elias closed the distance between himself and his daughters, each step measured, deliberate, the sound of his boots on the plank floor louder than it should have been. Clara stood so close to the woman now that the hem of her dress brushed against Nayeli's skirt, and Molly tilted her head back with open curiosity, as if she were studying a new teacher instead of someone the town treated like a stranger. Nayeli's hands tightened slightly around the folded cloth she carried, not defensive, not afraid, simply bracing, as though she had learned that kindness could vanish without warning. Elias felt the weight of a dozen glances press against his shoulders. Old Mr. Grady by the grain barrels stopped counting coins. Mrs. Porter near the stove fixed her lips into a thin line. Even the clerk, Thomas Hale, who had known Elias for 15 years, watched with cautious interest. Elias cleared his throat again, softer this time. "Girls," he said evenly, the word carrying both warning and patience. Clara did not move. "She made this blanket," Clara said, running her small fingers across the neat stitching. "Look how straight the lines are." Molly nodded eagerly. "And it is warm," she added, pressing her cheek lightly against the fabric as though it were proof of something important. Nayeli finally lifted her eyes to meet Elias's. They were steady, dark and thoughtful, not pleading, not defiant. He noticed then that her hands bore the fine calluses of someone who worked daily, the kind that came from needle and thread, from washing and mending, from building quiet things that lasted. She spoke carefully. "I sell what I sew," she said, her English clear, touched only faintly by another rhythm. That is all. There was no apology in her tone, no challenge either, just truth. Elias felt Clara's hand slip into his again, small and warm. "Papa," she said, her voice softer now. "Can she come to the ranch and show us how to sew like that?" The request landed gently, but it carried farther than a shout. Mrs. Porter let out a faint scoff. Someone near the doorway muttered something about lines that should not be crossed. Elias did not turn toward them. He kept his gaze on Nayeli. He remembered the long winter nights after his wife died, when Clara tried to stitch a torn apron and pricked her finger twice before giving up in tears. He remembered Molly asking why no one braided her hair the way her mother used to. He had done his best. He had learned to cook, to mend, to wake before sunrise and work until dark. But there were spaces in a house that hard work alone could not fill. Nayeli shifted slightly, as if preparing to step back and spare him the decision. Instead, she waited. And in that waiting, Elias understood something simple and unsettling. His daughters were not asking for a purchase. They were asking him to see what they already saw. The silence inside Mercer's general store stretched thin as wire pulled tight between fence posts, and Elias felt it humming in his ears while Clara and Molly stood beside Nayeli as though they had already chosen their place. He drew in a slow breath that tasted of flour dust and lamp oil, steadying himself the way he did before signing a contract or shaking on a cattle deal. He was a man who understood transactions. This was not one. He glanced once toward the front window where late sunlight spilled across the warped boards, then back at the woman his daughters refused to step away from. Nayeli's chin remained level, her shoulders squared but relaxed, as if she had learned long ago that dignity did not require permission. Elias crouched slightly so he could speak at eye level with his girls. "We came for ribbon and sugar," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice calm. Clara did not argue. She simply answered, "We can come back for ribbon." Molly tightened her grip on Nayeli's skirt, not possessive, just certain. "She looks like she knows how to make things last," Molly said. The words were simple, but they struck Elias harder than any protest from the room. He straightened slowly, aware of Thomas Hale shifting behind the counter. "Whitmore," Thomas called, attempting a friendly tone that carried warning beneath it. "Your wagon is still hitched out front. No need to make a scene over sewing." Elias did not turn. "No one is making a scene," he replied evenly. Mrs. Porter let out a short breath. "It starts small," she murmured to no one in particular. Elias heard it. He heard every whisper. He also heard the echo of winter wind against the empty side of his bed at the ranch, the sound of Clara coughing alone in the dark when fever came through last January, the way Molly had once asked if mothers ever came back if you waited long enough. He had told them no. He had believed it. Nayeli shifted her bundle to one arm and finally spoke again, her voice low but clear enough for all to hear. "If your daughters wish to learn, I can teach them," she said. "At your home, or here. It does not matter." There was no assumption in her offer, no reach beyond what had been asked. Elias studied her face for a long moment, searching for calculation, for need, for something that might explain why his daughters had attached themselves to her so quickly. He found none of that. He found steadiness, the kind that does not break under stairs. Clara squeezed his hand again. "Papa," she said, softer now, "you said we could choose." The words settled in his chest like a weight that was also a key. Around them, the store remained frozen, waiting to see whether Elias Whitmore would bend to custom or to his own promise. He realized then that the choice before him was not about fabric or lessons or even the town's approval. It was about whether he would teach his daughters to shrink when others expected it, or to stand as straight as the woman they had chosen. The air inside the store shifted almost imperceptibly, like the moment before a summer storm when the wind changes direction without warning, and Elias felt that shift settle into his bones as he looked from his daughters to Nayeli and then to the silent faces lining the narrow aisles. He had spent 20 years building a name in Mercer, acre by acre, handshake by handshake, hauling timber in winter and driving cattle 30 miles south in August heat that cracked the earth open. Reputation, he knew, was as fragile as glass and twice as hard to mend once broken. Yet Clara's words lingered in his chest with a steadiness that no whisper could shake. "You said we could choose." He rose to his full height and let his gaze move slowly across the room, not challenging, not apologizing, simply present. "My daughters asked a question," he said evenly. "I have not heard anything improper in it." Thomas Hale shifted his weight behind the counter, folding his hands as if to smooth the tension. "No one is accusing the girls," he replied carefully. "It is just that folks here have their ways." Elias nodded once. So do I. The words were quiet, but they landed with a firmness that did not invite argument. He turned back to Nayeli. Up close, he noticed a faint thread of blue woven into the edge of her blanket, a detail precise and deliberate. You teach sewing, he said. Where did you learn? Nayeli met his eyes without flinching. From my mother, she answered. And from hers before that. We teach what we know so that something good does not disappear. There was no bitterness in her voice, only memory. Clara looked between them as if witnessing something important unfold. Molly tugged lightly at Elias's sleeve. Papa, she could come on Saturdays, Molly suggested, practical as ever. After chores. A few people near the door exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Porter let out a thin breath, but said nothing more. The moment stretched again, but it no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a crossroads. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded $10 bill, the kind he might spend on extra feed or a new bridle. He held it out toward Nayeli. For your time, he said. If you are willing to come to the ranch this Saturday, 10 in the morning. Nayeli looked at the bill, then at the girls, then back at Elias. I will come, she said simply. She accepted the money not as charity, but as an agreement. The sound in the store began to return in cautious fragments. A cough here, a shuffle there, as though the world had decided not to split open after all. Elias felt Clara's small hand slip confidently into his again, and Molly's fingers wrapped around his other side. He did not look at the townsfolk as he guided his daughters toward the door. The bell above it chimed once as they stepped into the late afternoon light, the sky wide and pale over Mercer's single main street. Behind them, whispers would continue. Ahead of them lay 12 miles of open road and a decision already set in motion. And for the first time in a long while, Elias did not feel the emptiness in his wagon quite as sharply as before. The wagon wheels rolled slow over the dry ruts leading out of Mercer, each turn creaking like old wood remembering too much, and Elias kept his eyes on the horizon while Clara and Molly sat close beside him on the bench, their small shoulders pressed together as if guarding a secret that had already begun to take root. The town shrank behind them, the wooden storefronts fading into pale shapes under the wide Kansas sky, and for a few miles no one spoke. The horses moved at an easy pace, hooves striking dust that lifted and settled in soft clouds along the 12-mile stretch back to the ranch. Elias held the reins steady, feeling the leather warm against his palms, thinking of the way Thomas Hale had avoided his eyes when they left, and the way Mrs. Porter's whisper had followed them out the door like a draft of cold air. Clara finally broke the silence. She will come on Saturday, she said with quiet certainty. It was not a question. Molly leaned forward, peering up at her father's face. You are not mad, are you? She asked gently, as if anger were something fragile that might crack if touched too roughly. Elias exhaled slowly. No, he answered after a moment. I am thinking. The road dipped slightly near Miller's Creek, where cottonwood trees cast thin shadows across the water. He remembered bringing his wife there once in early spring, when the grass had just begun to turn green, and how she had laughed at something small and ordinary. That memory did not hurt as sharply as it once had, but it lingered like the scent of rain long after a storm passes. Do you miss her? Less now, Clara asked suddenly, her voice careful. Elias tightened his grip on the reins, surprised by the directness of the question. I do not miss her less, he said honestly. I just carry it differently. The girls nodded as if they understood more than children their age should. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped lower, the main house standing sturdy against the open land, the barn 100 yards to the east, fences stretching across nearly 200 acres of dry pasture. It was a good life by most measures. Cattle were healthy. The well still held strong at 40 feet. The roof did not leak. Yet as Elias guided the wagon into the yard and helped the girls down, he noticed how quiet the house sounded even before they stepped inside. No soft humming from the kitchen. No extra pair of boots by the door. Clara paused on the porch and looked up at him. It will not feel so empty on Saturday, she said, more to herself than to him. Elias studied the worn boards beneath his feet, then the open doorway leading into the dim interior. He had agreed to a sewing lesson. Nothing more. And yet as the wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line, he sensed that something had already shifted, as if the land itself were waiting to see whether the promise made in a dusty store would change the shape of the home it guarded. Saturday arrived with a pale blue sky stretched wide over the ranch and a wind that carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain, and Elias had been awake since before sunrise, long before Clara and Molly hurried into the kitchen still half-dressed, hair uncombed, eyes bright with a kind of anticipation that made the house feel smaller and warmer all at once. He had already finished the morning chores, checked the water trough near the south fence line, and walked the perimeter of the barn, not because it needed inspection, but because waiting had never been his strength. At exactly 10 o'clock, he heard the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel outside the porch. Clara froze mid-step. Molly gripped the edge of the table. Elias set down the tin coffee cup in his hand and moved toward the door, each step measured. When he opened it, Nayeli stood there alone, a small basket hooked over her arm, the same steady expression resting on her face as it had in Mercer. The sunlight framed her against the open land, no town walls behind her now, only miles of sky and pasture. "Good morning," she said, voice calm. "Good morning," Elias replied. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then Clara rushed forward, stopping just short of touching Nayeli, as if remembering that respect could be shown without grabbing hold. Molly followed more carefully this time. Nayeli stepped inside when Elias moved aside, and the house seemed to shift around her presence, as though it were testing the sound of a new voice within its walls. She set the basket on the kitchen table and unfolded pieces of cloth in quiet order, threads of red, blue, and cream catching the light from the window. "We begin with straight lines," she told the girls gently. "Strong things are built from simple stitches." Clara sat upright, listening as though each word carried weight. Molly leaned closer, careful not to disturb the neat arrangement. Elias remained near the doorway at first, arms folded loosely across his chest, observing without interference. He watched how Nayeli guided Clara's fingers, not correcting with sharpness, but with patience, letting the child feel the motion before adjusting it. He noticed how Molly laughed softly when her thread tangled, and how Nayeli did not laugh at her, but with her, easing the knot with careful hands. The house did not feel as quiet anymore. It felt focused. After an hour, Elias stepped forward and poured water into a fourth tin cup without speaking, placing it near Nayeli's elbow. She glanced up, surprised but not startled, and inclined her head in thanks. He nodded once in return. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass beyond the fence line, but inside, something steadier was taking shape, measured not in acres or cattle, but in the quiet rhythm of needle passing through cloth, back and forth, binding pieces together that had once been separate. By the time the church bell in Mercer would have struck noon, the kitchen table at the Whitmore Ranch was scattered with small, careful stitches and uneven lines that held more determination than skill, and Elias found himself lingering closer than he had intended, drawn not by curiosity alone but by the sound of his daughters laughing in a way he had not heard in years. Clara bit her lower lip as she guided the needle through the cloth, her brow furrowed with fierce concentration, while Molly held her fabric up to the light as though examining a treasure map. Nayeli moved between them with quiet assurance, adjusting a wrist here, steadying a thread there, her voice low and even. "Do not pull too tight," she reminded Clara gently. "If you pull too tight, the cloth cannot breathe." Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorway, arms folded, watching the simple rhythm of it all. He had spent most of his life believing strength meant holding firm, keeping tension where it belonged, never allowing slack. Yet as he listened to Nayeli explain how fabric could pucker and warp if forced too hard, he wondered how many things in his own house had been pulled too tight by grief. Molly glanced up at him suddenly. "Papa, look," she said, holding up a crooked line of red thread that wandered across cream cloth like a winding creek. Elias stepped forward and studied it with the seriousness he might give to a new fence line. "It looks strong," he said after a moment. Molly beamed. Nayeli watched the exchange quietly, a faint softness in her eyes that she did not try to hide. Outside, the wind shifted and rattled the loose hinge on the barn door, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch continued as it always had. Inside, something slower was unfolding. After another hour, Clara set her needle down and looked at Nayeli with open curiosity. "Did your mother teach you when you were my age?" she asked. Naeli paused before answering. Yes, she said. She said that when you sew, you remember who you belong to. The words settled into the room like dust in sunlight. Elias felt them more than he understood them. Belonging had once been simple for him. A wife at his side, 2 small girls underfoot, a future that felt mapped and certain. Now belonging seemed less like a map and more like a choice made in small, quiet moments. He stepped outside for a breath of air, standing on the porch and looking over the 100 yards to the barn, the fence post stretching out toward the horizon. He knew Mercer would talk. He knew. Some men would measure his decisions in cattle prices and handshake agreements. But as he listened through the open window to Clara's laughter and Molly's earnest questions, he realized that the sound inside the house carried more weight than the silence of the town. When he turned back toward the door, he did not hesitate before stepping inside again. The afternoon light softened as it stretched across the ranch house floor, turning the dust in the air into slow drifting gold, and the steady rhythm of needle through cloth continued long after Elias had returned from the porch, as though the house itself had settled into a new heartbeat. Clara's stitches had grown straighter, her shoulders relaxing with each careful pull, while Molly hummed under her breath, repeating the pattern Naeli had shown her, in and out, like breathing made visible. Naeli sat between them now rather than across the table, her presence no longer foreign against the worn wood and familiar chairs. She listened more than she spoke, answering questions about thread and patterns with patience that did not feel practiced but natural. When Clara asked why certain colors were placed side by side, Naeli explained how contrast made each shade stronger, how red beside blue seemed brighter than red alone. Elias noticed the way Clara absorbed that idea, as though it reached beyond fabric. Outside, a rider appeared in the distance along the fence line, a lone figure cutting across the far pasture road. Elias recognized the shape before he saw the face. It was Harold Bennett from Mercer, a man who bought feed twice a month and liked to weigh other men's choices as if they were grain. The horse slowed near the gate, and Harold tipped his hat but did not dismount. "Afternoon, Whitmore," he called, voice carrying across the yard. Elias stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door open behind him. "Afternoon," he answered evenly. Harold's gaze shifted past him into the house, lingering a second too long. "Heard you had company," Harold said, not quite smiling. Elias followed the look without turning his head. "Sewing lessons," he replied. "For the girls." Harold adjusted the reins in his hands. "Town is talking," he said, as if offering weather news. Elias nodded once. "Town often does." A brief silence passed between them, filled with the low rustle of wind through dry grass. Harold studied him for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for justification or apology. Neither came. Finally, he gave a short nod and nudged his horse back toward the road, dust rising behind him in a pale trail. Elias remained on the porch until the rider disappeared beyond the cottonwoods, then stepped back inside. The kitchen felt warmer now, not from heat but from presence. Clara held up her finished square, edges uneven but proud. "It is not perfect," she said carefully. Naeli smiled softly. "It is yours," she answered. Molly leaned against Naeli's arm without thinking, as natural as if she had done so for years. Elias watched that small gesture, the easy trust in it, and understood that whatever Mercer chose to say would remain outside these walls unless he carried it in himself. The ranch stood on 200 acres of open land, fenced and marked, but the boundaries that mattered most were the ones drawn in a man's mind. As the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the floor, Elias felt something within those boundaries shift again, not with noise or drama, but with the quiet certainty of stitches binding separate pieces into something that could endure. Evening settled over the ranch with a quiet authority, stretching long shadows across the pasture and painting the sky in faded orange and soft gray, and inside the house the sewing lesson drew to a natural close as the last thread was tied and trimmed with careful fingers. Clara placed her small square of stitched fabric on the table, as if setting down something sacred, and Molly leaned her head briefly against Naeli's arm, no hesitation left in the gesture. Elias cleared his throat gently, aware that the hour had grown late. "It will be dark before long," he said, glancing toward the window where the sun hovered just above the horizon. Naeli nodded and began gathering her things, folding each piece of cloth with the same attention she had given the lesson. There was no rush in her movements, no sign that she felt unwelcome, yet no assumption that she would remain. Clara followed her to the door, carrying the small basket, as if entrusted with something important. Molly walked beside them, unusually quiet. On the porch, the air had cooled, and the wind carried the scent of distant sage. Elias stepped ahead and saddled his horse without being asked. "It is 6 miles back toward Mercer," he said. "I will ride with you to the creek." Naeli hesitated only a moment before inclining her head in agreement. Clara's hand tightened around the porch railing. "She will come back next Saturday," she said, not to Naeli but to her father. Elias met his daughter's eyes. "If she is willing," he replied. Naeli looked at the girls then, her expression softening in a way that suggested something deeper than politeness. "I am willing," she said simply. The words carried weight in the quiet dusk. Elias and Naeli rode side by side along the narrow dirt path that cut through the pasture, the sound of hooves steady against packed earth. For a while, neither spoke. Crickets began their evening song, and the first stars pricked through the fading light. At the edge of Miller's Creek, where cottonwoods leaned toward the water, Elias slowed his horse. "Harold Bennett stopped by," he said at last, his voice even. Naeli did not appear surprised. "People talk," she replied. "They talked before today." Elias considered that. "It may not stop," he said. Naeli's gaze remained forward, steady on the path ahead. "I did not come for them," she answered. "I came for the girls." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any warning from Mercer. At the shallow crossing, she guided her horse carefully through the water, then paused on the opposite bank. "Thank you for the work," she said. Elias nodded once. "Thank you for coming." There were a dozen other things he could have said, but none felt necessary. He watched as she rode on toward the distant lights of town, her figure gradually blending into the deepening blue of evening. When he turned his horse back toward the ranch, the night felt different than it had the evening before, not lighter exactly, but less hollow. Behind him, the creek flowed steady and quiet, carrying reflections of the first stars, as if reminding him that some changes do not announce themselves with noise, only with the quiet certainty of water moving forward. Monday came with a dry wind sweeping across the pasture and a sky so clear it felt almost unforgiving, and Elias rose before dawn as he always did, pulling on his boots in the quiet dark while Clara and Molly still slept down the narrow hall. The memory of Saturday lingered in the house like the faint scent of thread and clean fabric, subtle but present. He stepped outside and walked the fence line along the east pasture, checking posts that had stood for years, pressing his palm against weathered wood as though testing whether anything had shifted in the night. By mid-morning he hitched the wagon and drove the 12 miles into Mercer with 2 crates of eggs and a ledger tucked beneath the seat. The town looked the same as it always had, storefronts squared against the road, dust curling low across the street. But when Elias stepped down from the wagon, he felt the difference in the air. Conversations dipped when he passed. Not silent, just lowered. He carried his ledger into Thomas Hale's store, set it on the counter, and waited. Thomas flipped through the pages with careful attention. "Prices are holding steady," Thomas said, though his tone carried something restrained. "Though buyers are particular these days." Elias met his gaze. "My cattle are sound," he replied evenly. Thomas nodded but did not disagree or agree. A few minutes later, Harold Bennett entered, hat tipped low, boots leaving faint prints across the floor. He offered a thin smile. "Heard you had another visitor yesterday," he said, casual in tone but not in intention. Elias closed the ledger and rested his hands flat on the counter. "I did," he answered. Harold leaned one shoulder against a flour barrel. "Folks are wondering how far it goes," he continued. "Lessons are one thing. Reputation is another." The words hung between them, not loud, not sharp, but deliberate. Elias did not raise his voice. "My daughters are learning to sew," he said. "That is how far it goes." Harold studied him, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps hoping for it. None came. After a moment, Harold gave a small shrug. "Town remembers," he said. Elias nodded once. "So do I." He gathered his ledger and stepped back into the sunlight, dust rising around his boots. Outside, Mrs. Porter stood near the post office, watching him with an unreadable expression. He met her eyes briefly, not challenging, not apologizing, then climbed back onto the wagon bench. The ride home felt longer than 12 miles. The wind pushed against him, tugging at his hat brim as though testing his balance. When the ranch finally came into view, Clara and Molly were waiting near the fence, waving as if he had been gone for weeks instead of hours. Elias felt something settle in his chest as he pulled the wagon to a stop. Whatever Mercer chose to measure him by, he understood now that the true weight of a man was not decided in a store or whispered across a street, but in the way he walked back through his own door and stood by the choices he had already made. Saturday returned with a low gray sky and the promise of rain that never quite fell, and Elias felt the weight of the week in his shoulders as he stacked feed sacks in the barn, aware that word from Mercer had traveled faster than any rider. 2 suppliers had delayed their usual visits. One handshake at the feed store had been shorter than it used to be. Nothing direct, nothing spoken plainly, just small shifts, like boards settling in a house before a storm. Clara and Molly sensed it too, though they did not have words for it. They stayed close that morning, helping with chores without being asked, carrying small buckets that were almost too heavy for their hands. When the clock on the mantel edged toward 10, both girls drifted toward the front porch without speaking. Elias watched them from the yard, a pitchfork resting against his shoulder, and understood that this was no longer about sewing alone. In the distance, along the narrow road that cut through the pasture, a single figure appeared on horseback. Nayeli rode steady, her posture straight against the wind. Clara gripped the porch railing. Molly stepped down into the yard before remembering to wait. Elias walked toward the gate as Nayeli approached, opening it without ceremony. "Good morning," she said, as though nothing in the world had changed since the week before. "Good morning," he replied. He studied her face for any sign that Mercer had treated her differently. If it had, she did not show it. Inside the house, the lesson began again, but there was a new quiet beneath the conversation. Clara's stitches were firmer now. Molly corrected her own thread before Nayeli needed to speak. After a while, Elias stepped to the table and placed a folded sheet of paper beside Nayeli's basket. It was a simple contract, written in his careful hand, offering steady payment for weekly lessons through the end of summer. Nayeli looked at it, then at him. "You do not have to prove anything," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "This is not for them," he answered. "It is for this house." The words settled deep. Clara glanced between them, sensing that something larger than thread was being tied together. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, testing the frame. Elias stood straighter, not defiant, not loud, simply present. He understood now that reputation built on silence could fade with a whisper, but a home built on courage held differently. Nayeli picked up the paper and folded it once, careful and deliberate, before placing it back on the table. "Then I will teach them," she said. "No more, no less." And in that quiet agreement, without raised voices or grand gestures, the line between fear and resolve grew thinner until it no longer held the same power it once did. The weeks that followed did not bring thunder or open confrontation, only the steady accumulation of small tests, and Elias met each one the same way he had faced the open plains for years, with quiet endurance and an unwillingness to step backward. By mid-July, the pasture grass had grown tall and brittle under the sun, and Clara and Molly had completed 3 neat squares of patterned cloth, each one more precise than the last. Nayeli came every Saturday at 10 o'clock without fail, sometimes on horseback, sometimes walking the 6 miles from Mercer when she preferred the silence of the road. Inside the Whitmore house, her presence no longer felt like an arrival. It felt expected. One afternoon, as the girls practiced stitching near the open window, a wagon rolled slowly up the lane. Elias recognized the team before the driver. It was Mrs. Porter, reins held tight in her gloved hands, her posture rigid as fence wire. Clara noticed first and stiffened. Molly's needle paused mid-stitch. Elias stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. Mrs. Porter brought the wagon to a stop and looked past him into the doorway where Nayeli sat with the girls. Her expression was not as sharp as it had been in the store weeks earlier, but it carried hesitation. "I heard the girls were making quilts," she said carefully. Elias nodded once. "They are learning." Mrs. Porter shifted in her seat. "My niece is to be married in August," she continued. "She needs table linens. I was told the stitching here is steady." The pause before the last word held more meaning than the word itself. Elias did not turn to look inside. "It is steady," he replied. Clara rose slowly and walked to the doorway, holding one of her finished pieces. The seams were straight, the corners squared. Nayeli remained seated at the table, hands folded calmly in her lap. Mrs. Porter studied the cloth for a long moment, her eyes moving over each careful line. Something in her posture eased, just slightly. "I will pay fair," she said at last. Elias stepped aside from the porch railing. "Then you may speak with the one who taught them," he answered evenly. There was no challenge in his voice, only clarity. Mrs. Porter hesitated, then climbed down from the wagon. She approached the doorway slowly, as if crossing an invisible boundary she had once defended. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint rustle of fabric. Nayeli stood, meeting her gaze without lowering her own. For a brief second, the world seemed balanced on that look alone. Then Mrs. Porter inclined her head. "I would like to place an order," she said. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the weight of something shifting beyond one porch, beyond one house. Clara exhaled softly. Molly smiled without understanding the full measure of what had just changed. And Elias, standing between open sky and open door, realized that sometimes the loudest turning points arrived without sound at all. By late August, the fields beyond the Whitmore ranch shimmered under a softer sun, the harsh edge of summer easing into something gentler, and inside the house the long table near the window was covered in finished linens bound for Mercer, each seam straight, each corner squared with quiet pride. Clara's hands no longer trembled when she threaded a needle. Molly no longer tangled her stitches, and Nayeli moved through the kitchen as though she had always known the way light fell across that floor in the afternoon. Orders had come steadily after Mrs. Porter's visit. Not all at once. Not loudly. One set of table linens for a wedding. A quilt square for a newborn. Then another request. Then another. No one in Mercer had offered an apology. None was needed. The work itself had spoken. Elias stood at the barn door one evening, watching Clara and Molly carry a folded bundle of cloth toward the porch where Nayeli waited with her basket. The girls laughed over some small mistake corrected earlier in the day, their voices easy and unguarded. There had been a time when laughter in that yard sounded thin, as if it were trying to fill too much empty space. Now it sounded anchored. Elias walked toward them slowly, boots pressing into dry earth that would soon turn cool with fall. He paused beside Nayeli as the girls hurried ahead into the house. For a moment they stood side by side without speaking, watching the horizon where the sky met 200 acres of land he had once believed he carried alone. "They are strong," Nayeli said quietly. Elias nodded. "They are learning," he replied. She glanced at him then, not with question, not with expectation, but with understanding. "So are you," she said. The words were not sharp. They were simple. True. Inside, Clara had begun setting an extra plate on the table without asking. Molly had braided a thin strip of red thread into the edge of a new cloth and said it made the pattern brighter. Elias stepped onto the porch and looked back toward the distant road leading to Mercer. The town still stood as it always had, dust rising in the same afternoon wind, storefronts facing the same direction. But something subtle had shifted. Not in their fences, not in their laws, in their willingness to walk through a doorway and place an order where once they had only stared. Elias removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, feeling the cool of approaching evening settle around him. He had not raised his voice. He had not drawn a line in the dirt. He had simply kept a promise to his daughters and opened his door. The rest had followed in its own time. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first star appeared above the pasture, the house behind him glowed warm against the darkening sky. Out here, justice did not arrive on horseback with noise and dust. It arrived in small, steady stitches, binding what had been separate into something that could hold. And Elias Whitmore understood at last that a home was not defended by shutting the world out, but by standing firm enough to let what was good step inside.